Hey, welcome back to AntiKing. You last saw me ranking Workaholics videos in late December, and at the end of that video, I announced a new season of Horror You Probably Slept On, which was supposed to kick off with a special Christmas episode covering Better Watch Out. And I'm sure you've spent the last month tirelessly wondering, why didn't he film that video? Well, I did. It just sounded like this. That's right, my mic went out mysteriously. I got this new one, which is a little more user-friendly. It's more customizable, I guess. Anyways, yeah, I'm gonna move the Better Watch Out video either to the end of this cycle or just have it in this December as its own Christmas thing. I don't know yet. What I do know is today we're covering 2021's Antlers. Antlers is a great embodiment of modern horror's leaning towards folk horror, in the vein of A24 films like Hereditary and The Witch. So much so, I actually thought Antlers was an A24 film. It's suspenseful and impactful and creepy, and yeah, let's just get into it. Before any of that, I did want to start with a real quick content warning. This movie does involve some depictions of child abuse, as well as some pretty vivid depictions of bullying. So if any of those things are too much for you, probably just skip this one. The movie opens with a foreboding poem, spoken in the native Ojibwe language. The poem fades to black and we're treated with a lovely shot of Alouette Lake, one of several of this film's Canadian shooting locations. We see the fog rolling in over the hills of an abandoned mining town, complete with meth head fathers on what appears to be take your kid to work day or something. I didn't know that applied to secret underground meth labs, but here we are. Before long, the Scratchy Bunch start to hear demonic growls coming from somewhere in the abandoned mine. They smartly decide to get the fuck out of there, but by the time they do, it's too late. They're seemingly torn apart by an unknown creature before the sun wanders into a title card. Miss you already, James. We then cut to 3 weeks later and our main protagonist, Julia, played by Carrie Russell, splashing water in her face in an attempt to get her shit together in her school's bathroom. She's a school teacher, and today she's teaching about mythology and folklore. Meanwhile, also in the classroom is our little boy from earlier, Lucas. His stuffed monkey got taken by some bullies who, have a special bond with it. Monkey butt loving.
Funky butt loving!
Did he just say funky butt loving?
Yeah.
The bell rings and class lets out as the boys continue to mock Lucas, and I'm sure that won't have any consequences. We then see Lucas as he walks along the shore of the lake, finding a skunk and a rock to bludgeon it with. He does the deed off screen and returns home to his father's ultra-locked door, Skunky Boy in hand. We see Julia in line at the grocery store, staring a bit too long at the alcohol behind the counter, implying that she may have some demons of her own. Out of some unexplained guilt, Julia returns to her childhood home when the piano catches her eye as she makes her way upstairs. She walks over to it before having a flashback to a traumatic event as a child. Julia was abused by an alcoholic father growing up, a detail that explains a lot of her character's motivation going forward. Her brother Paul, who's the sheriff, comes in just in time to interrupt her flashback to make some small talk. He leaves her be and we get a brilliant sequence of the duality of our main characters. Julia is looking at old family photos with disdain, and seemingly a bit of fear. This is cut excellently, with Lucas looking over an old photo of his family, longing for what things were like just a short time ago. In a rage, he cuts the head off his monkey toy. We hear the rumblings of demonic voices and something pounding against the super locked door before we cut again to Julia and Paul. They discuss briefly their living arrangements before Paul laments having to evict a family with kids. Well then choose a real job, Paul. After some more bullying, Lucas reads a disturbing story about 3 bears. 2 little and 1 big. Big Bear used to take care of the little bears until one day he got sick and lost his job and turned his insides black. One day, Little Bear came home and Big Bear and Baby Bear were different. The disease had gotten worse, and Big Bear was angry because they didn't have any food, specifically any meat, hence the skunk bludgeoning. Outside, the biggest and most ginger of the bully group discovers Lucas has gotten a little bit of comeuppance with some dog poo left in his backpack. This, of course, however, only leads to Lucas getting bullied even harder. This leads to a trip to the nurse, where Julia does some snooping and gets Lucas' address from his personnel file. Super illegal. She first attempts to call Lucas' parents, but unfortunately his mom is dead and his dad is, well, unavailable. Even creepier, Julia decides to follow Lucas on his way home, seeing him stop by and look longingly through the window of an ice cream shop. What if Lucas wasn't going through anything? He just knew this weird lady was watching him and this was all just a scheme to get ice cream. She approaches him and before long they're inside chowing down on some ice cream. She pokes and prods with some funny questions about donuts being fruit before eventually asking about his brother. He says he's at home, to which she asks if he's there with their mom. Lucas tells her his mom is dead, and Jillian relates to him that her mom is dead too. She keeps prodding about his brother and dad until eventually Lucas gets uncomfortable and leaves, telling her not to follow him this time. Ha! It was for ice cream, I knew it! Julia, however, does not heed his advice and follows him on his walk home, him stopping on the way to pick up a mangled animal carcass. Eventually, Julia makes it up to Lucas's house, where the door even cracks open on its own, but she decides not to go in based on the growls and banging she hears coming from inside. Good call, Jules. She's now at her kitchen table piecing together a drawing that Lucas ripped up before Paul pops in over her shoulder to scare her. He does that a lot in this movie. We get a short sequence of her expressing her regret for having abandoned her little brother despite the ongoing abuse at home, but he's hesitant to accept her apology, telling her he spent his entire life praying for her to come back. I love how this movie fleshes out these characters in particular, and the performances by Russell and Jesse Plemons are just spectacular. We cut again to Lucas, who's preparing some roadkill snacks, it appears. He boxes the food up and prepares to take it to his dad and little brother. Literally, it's in a to-go box. Why is that so funny to me? He approaches the room timidly, setting the plate down. His little brother, Aiden, is shown on screen for the first time and, despite looking rough, seems to be doing pretty okay. The dad, however, doesn't sound human anymore. He starts to grunt and growl at Lucas, so he gets the fuck out of there. Good call, Lucas. Julia is playing the piano again, as an apparition of her father appears and begins touching her neck and chest inappropriately. She snaps to with a jump as Paul places his hand on her shoulder. Told ya. We cut to Lucas working on another macabre masterpiece as he begins to hear his little brother banging on the door, telling him that he's hungry. Lucas drowns out the noise with headphones and creepy doll cuddles before heading out to set some animal traps in the woods. He hears a noise behind him and decides to investigate. What he finds is a hunter who's come across something horrific. A mangled human corpse. Clearly shaken, the hunter walks away. Also clearly shaken, Lucas sprints. Methinks Frank might have something to do with that corpse. Meanwhile, Julia is now invading Lucas's privacy by rifling through his desk at school. Julia kinda sucks, but she means well. She finds a Bible and a book about animal traps, as well as a book about demons and the Communist Manifesto. I made the last one up. She does, however, discover a notebook full of Lucas's gory artwork, which she shows to the principal of the school, Mrs. Booth. She says that although there seem to be obvious signs of abuse, they can't do anything about it. She does, however, give a half-hearted promise to reach out to Lucas's father before handing Julia her papers back and sending her on her way. We see a brief glimpse of her at the store from before, only this time, she looks at those liquor bottles just a little bit harder. She leaves, and on the sidewalk sees her brother on duty with his partner, talking with the hunter from the woods, who's describing the scene he just discovered. The hunter also just so happens to be former Sheriff Warren Stokes. They tell him they'll go check it out, and he leaves just as Julia is approaching. Julia asks what's going on, and Paul reveals that they found half a body in the woods, the other half in a mine shaft near a meth lab. He posits that it was probably a bear, and definitely not our Lord and Shepherd.
From what he just told me, I don't think Jesus was anywhere to be found.
We're back at the cabin with Lucas, whose little brother has some heavy questions for him.
Is God really dead?
Before we get a glimpse of old Frank writhing and reeling in the corner. We get a sweet moment between siblings as Lucas reminds his little brother that their deceased mother said they were born under the lucky star. Lucas then gives him a snack, but much to his shock, the little boy starts coughing up black bile as well as secreting it from his eye. We cut to a sick shot of the corpse from earlier, as Paul suggests to the coroner that surely this is the result of an animal attack, but the coroner disagrees, saying determining the cause of death is nearly impossible. He says the most disturbing part is that many of the teeth marks found on the corpse appear human, but the mangled state of that corpse suggests otherwise. We cut then to Principal Booth, whose half-hearted promise turned out to be a little bit more, as she's approaching the Weaver cabin. She enters the front door and calls out for someone, as we get a beautiful sequence cutting between her and Lucas in class making a dope-ass deer sculpture thing. Seriously, where can I find one of these? I've looked everywhere. Anyways, Principal Booth is now exploring the house, finding it in squalor with the electricity no longer working. Now, how in the fuck is Lucas supposed to pay that bill, lady?
Huh?
She stumbles upon the ultra-locked door and starts to poke around, making her way into the room, where she's hit with what I have to assume based on her reaction is just a putrid smell. She enters the room at the top of the staircase, which I guess means this has been in the attic the whole time. Suddenly, Frank attacks her from behind, glowing chest and all. He bites off her finger before biting out her throat and killing her. He then proceeds to eat her face and begins some kind of bone-snapping transformation, which only ends when antlers begin sprouting from his mouth. Oh, what the fuck? We cut to a bunch of police, including Paul and Sheriff Stokes from earlier, arriving at the mine from the opening scene. They investigate but find very little outside of a broken antler before receiving a staticky call about a missing person. We then see Lucas walking down a train track in the middle of the woods in a beautiful shot. It's an incredibly serene but short-lived sequence, as Lucas's bully shows up shortly into his walk and begins taking some pretty personal jabs at him. Lucas attempts to walk away, but the bully just won't let up, and soon they find themselves face to face with a large, antlered creature. Lucas runs off, good call Lucas, while his bully gets absolutely demolished in the background.
Well, if it isn't the consequences of my own actions.
He eventually makes it back home, but is horrified by the implications when he sees his principal's car already there. He runs to the attic and finds that his fears have come true. His dad has escaped and taken Aiden with him. Lucas then covers the principal's car with a tarp and starts cleaning the blood tracks in the house, as Paul tells Julia about Miss Booth's missing person status. Paul is now in the principal's office as the bully, whose name is Clint apparently, has gone missing too. Paul explains to Clint's mom that with the little information they currently have, they'll have to work off the assumption that his and Principal Booth's disappearances have nothing to do with each other, which upsets Julia as she storms off. He tries to reason with her that these processes take time, but she's not taking that as an excuse and storms off again, stopping to peek into Lucas's classroom, where he almost seems to sense her. She leaves and drives directly to the Weaver place, finding Principal Booth's car. The next day, search warrant in hand, the police discover Booth's corpse torn to shreds in the attic of the Weavers.
To shreds, you say?
They also discover the charred husk of Frank, who is now fully transformed. Julia is waiting outside and intercepts Lucas on his way in. We cut to the hospital as the doctor approaches Paul and Julia and explains that Lucas shows obvious signs of both physical and mental abuse. Paul and Julia then argue over the prospect of Lucas staying with them, with Paul mentioning that he thinks Julia might be projecting her issues with her own childhood abuse onto the situation. We then see Lucas laying fetally in his hospital bed, having a flashback about the early days of his family's demise. In the flashback, we see Frank desperately trying to protect his children from himself as he begins to spew black bile. He installs the locks we've seen throughout on the attic door and tells Lucas not to let him out no matter what he says. It cuts to a time sometime later where Aiden has become the same kind of sick as their dad, who's deteriorated horribly. He drags Aiden into the attic with him, and thus began the horrible journey Lucas is currently on. Paul and Julia seek out Sheriff Stokes from earlier with some of the artifacts from the case, such as Lucas's drawings or the charms at the mouth of the mine meant to ward off evil spirits. He asks if the child who drew these pictures was native, and was shocked to find he was not. He shows him the antler he found in the mine, and how it matches to a depiction of a Wendigo he has in a book. He then goes on to explain what is one of several different origins of the Wendigo, and it stands to mention that the creators of Antlers went to great length to consult with natives on the mythology of the Wendigo, as they found it so crucial to get right. And good on them! One of the horror genre's greatest sins has been whitewashing or simplifying native culture for entertainment purposes. Not only is it harmful and straight up disrespectful to that culture, it's lazy. Make up your own monster instead of riding the coattails of ancient mythology for recognition's sake. It's gross. Anyways, in this version of the mythology, the Wendigo is more or less an embodiment of evil. It attached itself to a hunter who had gotten lost and had to eventually resort to cannibalism. And once he had gotten a taste for human flesh, he transformed into an amorphous spirit which can take many forms. His appetite can never be satisfied, so he roams the forest in search of victims. He explains the only way to kill a Wendigo is to attack it while it's feasting, and only by extinguishing its beating heart, when it will then search for another host. I guess that explains the glowing chest earlier. Beleaguered on his drive home, Paul receives a call to come to a spot down by the tracks for yet another mangled body.
To shreds, you say?
He arrives to find it's Clint, Lucas's bully. He begs the coroner to tell him it was the train, but the truth is clear to both Paul and his partner. Something ate him. After a brief discussion between Paul and Julia, in which Paul expresses his cynicism despite the overwhelming evidence, we see the pair taking Lucas home from the hospital, whilst Paul's partner Dan takes a look around Paul's house. I still don't completely understand why though. Meanwhile, Lucas and Julia are inside, bonding over their shared, although very different, family trauma. As Dan stalks the perimeter of the house, he hears a scream from the woods. Inside, Julia tells Lucas that his dad has died, which Lucas calmly responds to that he isn't, and that he's coming for him, to take him into the mine with him, like Aiden. The way his line,
I just have to feed him, and he'll love me,
encapsulates the whole themes of this entire movie is just brilliant writing. Meanwhile, outside, Dan is investigating the continuous screams he's hearing. The screams are beginning to become otherworldly in both volume and sound. Dan pulls his gun out in anticipation and attempts to call Paul as he walks towards the shed. Paul throws the lights on in his cruiser and burns some serious rubber to get back to his sister, while Julia and Lucas take shelter in an upstairs bedroom. Dan opens up the shed to find something moving underneath a blanket in a small, roughly Aiden-sized box on the floor. The tension ratchets up as Aiden's head peeks out, and Dan radios to Paul his discovery. Out of nowhere, Antlers rip through Dan's chest in the exceedingly rare, earned jump scare. Paul comes home to Dan's corpse, but no Wendigo in sight. He cocks his gun as he gets out to investigate, while Lucas sprints outside, having recognized the screams as Aiden's and wanting to see his brother. Julia watches from a window as Paul enters the shed and tries to ensure Aiden he'll be okay, only to be tossed aside by the Wendigo. He fumbles for his radio before realizing it's been destroyed and slowly sliding his way out along the shed wall. The Wendigo breaks through the wall in an attempt to impale Paul, but fails to penetrate Paul's bulletproof vest. It does, however, get caught in the vest, and the Wendigo starts violently slamming Paul against the shed wall. Who built this shed? God damn. It's a strong-ass shed. Paul passes out and the Wendigo retreats, but not before ramming the wall one last time. Meanwhile, Julia is now just kind of casually walking around on the porch, as if there's not a violent cryptid lurking somewhere nearby. Seriously, this character has no sense of self-preservation here. It's one of my only knocks on this movie. Like, if you're out there for a reason, walk with a purpose, duck, or try to hide a little or something. If you're not out there for a reason, go inside. There's a mythical beast out there and it kills people. What are you even doing? She steps out to Paul's truck, calling quietly for Lucas, and then to the shed where she finds Paul in bad shape. She checks on him and bandages him up, as he talks her into taking him with her back to the mine in search of Lucas, Aiden, Frank, and a final showdown. Let's go! They arrive and Julia is calling for an ambulance to the entrance of the mine. She timidly gets out and steps in, passing seemingly hundreds of those charms on her way in. She eventually makes her way to an opening where she finds both Lucas and Aiden hiding behind an abandoned piece of machinery. The children beg her to turn around before she eventually realizes why. Just a few feet away is Frank, fully transformed and chowing down on a dead bear. Julia attempts to shoot the beast in its heart like she was told, but it just smacks the gun out of her hand. She crawls to grab it and takes a few random shots into the darkness before eventually hitting the creature. It continues to pursue her until eventually she lights a flare to distract it as she uses a nearby pole to stab it in the chest. Convenient pole placement. Julia manages to impale the monster, but he's unscathed. At the last possible moment, Lucas jumps onto the Wendigo's back and stabs him, killing him once and for all. He's my dad, I'll kill him. Julia adds in some bonus stabs though, just in case. Nah, but what she does do is cut out his red-hot heart in front of his son. God damn, man. Soon, we hear the bone-snapping sound of Aiden slowly transitioning into the next Wendigo. Julia and Lucas have a tough talk before she does what she has to be done and stabs Aiden to death. Lucas covers his ears as we're transported to yet another serene shot of Alouette Lake, where a healing Paul and Julia discuss adopting Lucas despite concerns that he may soon transform into a Wendigo. They decide it's a risk they're going to take as they walk off, Paul lagging just behind. Suddenly, Paul begins to cough up the same black bile we saw from Frank before the movie cuts to black. Alright, for this season of Slept On, we're gonna do the rating system a little bit different, a little bit more simplified. So I'm only going to rate these on gore, suspense, score, and story. Not in that order. Let's go, run it! While the story was somewhat simplistic, I think the writing was done outstandingly. I think it touched on some bleak topics with a great deal of poise. It was also clever and at times downright terrifying. I think it was incredibly well done. 9 out of 10. I had to carry over the score rating from last season because to me it really is that important to a horror movie. That said, this one's just above average. It works great in key spots and leaves you maybe wanting more in others. There's also nothing particularly unique about the arrangements in the score, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Overall, I'd say it does its job well enough. 7 out of 10. The suspense in this movie is outstandingly crafted. Its gray tones throughout mixed with the visceral depictions of both violence and transformation really make your skin crawl. And while the score might not be anything particularly outstanding, it establishes a great baseline for everything that happened. 9 out of 10. Fans of this channel know I am a gorehound, and this movie satisfies that need plenty. There are times where I felt it could have been better, but there's certainly some over-the-top stuff here. 8 out of 10. So 33 out of 40 equals out to roughly 83%. Not a bad start to the new season. This movie is incredibly refreshing while feeling familiar. It's tense, it's gory, it's definitely worth a watch if you're a fan of the genre. So that's it. That was Antlers. Thank you so much for watching this. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to my channel. Since this is technically my first video of the year, I figured I'd use it to update you guys on some of my plans for the year. Of course, I'm doing these slept on videos, which I'm gonna do 12 this year, just like last year. I plan on doing 2 a month for the next 6 months or something like that, but it's gonna be kind of loosey-goosey. The Underappreciated Career Of is coming back. The next one will cover Allison Brie. That should be next week. I also plan on doing Bryce Dallas Howard, Christina Hendricks, Jason Segel, Jennifer Morrison, Taryn Manning. There's probably 6 or 7 I'm gonna do this year. And who knows, that list is shrinking and expanding at any time, and I'm still debating on whether or not to do Rose McGowan. I probably will. Also, I'm going to get back to another Grizzly chapter, but it didn't do super well. It was a whole lot of work to put together, and then I wrote almost the entirety of the second episode, which was obviously going to be Hatchet 2, and the whole thing deleted itself, which had me kind of discouraged on top of no one really watching it. But at some point I'm going to dive back in, at least finish the Hatchet series. Also, sometime in April around 420, I will start my next reaction series. Last year I did the Hulu series Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, and despite those being some of my worst performing videos, I'd argue they're some of my funniest, so I'm really looking forward to whatever the next thing is. There will also be some off-the-cuff stuff, obviously, when I feel like something needs to be talked about, or... Anyway, I'm happy to be back. I'm happy to be doing the damn thing again. That Allison Brie video should be out next week. And in the meantime, stay safe.